Throughout 2020 and even in 2021, China seems to be at odds with all powerful nations in the world. That is, the United States, Japan, and the European nations, not to speak about India. But 49 years ago, China was in isolation until an American president decided that he needed to end that isolation of China and bring it into the Committee of Nations. As we near half a century of that event, this week, I want to concentrate on President Richard Nixon's historical visit to China in 1972 and the changes that it brought into geopolitics since then. You're on Simply Nitin and I'm Nitin Gokhale. This week, 49 years ago, that is between February 21 and 28, 1972, President Richard Nixon, along with his confidant Henry Kissinger, who was then the National Security Advisor of the United States, embarked on a historical journey to China. This week-long stay in Beijing, Shanghai and Hangzhou is seen as a big breakthrough in recent geopolitical history of the world. Why is that so? That's because 25 years before that, the United States, the most powerful country in the world then, and perhaps now, had decided not to have any diplomatic relations or communications with China. China was a backward country, a communist country, and someone who was taking on both the Soviet Union or the erstwhile USSR and the Americans. China was on the opposite side of the American effort in the Korean War in 1950, which lasted for 3 years until 1953. But Americans were also feeling the pressure of the changing geopolitical landscape in the early 70s. The Vietnam War was not going the American way. The Soviets were more and more aggressive. So President Richard Nixon and his National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger decided to reach out to China. So on 15 July 1971, Nixon made a very surprise and a shocking announcement at that time to say that he will be traveling to the People's Republic of China in the following year. It took more than 6 months to prepare for that visit, but that announcement itself came as a shock because of the circumstances that I mentioned, where both sides had kept away from each other. China was an isolated country and an unknown country in most parts. So why did Richard Nixon do it? He did it because the Americans then thought that by bringing in China on board the Committee of Nations and bringing China into the world system, it will become profitable. The Chinese would become a profitable venture, or the American companies and American economy will benefit from the Chinese market, and gradually China may even become a democracy. 49 years down the line, while one prediction has come true, the other has not. And that one prediction is that the Chinese, more than anybody else, have benefited because of that opening up that Richard Nixon initiated. China has become powerful economically. It now straddles the world economy. It is now number 2 in the pecking order as far as world economies go after the United States in less than 50 years. China actually has taken advantage of that opening up much more than the Americans could. The Americans, in fact, have suffered because most of the business, most of the manufacturing moved out of US to China over the years, and now the Americans feel the pinch. So one prediction or one anticipation went wrong, and that is, while the Americans and the democratic world thought that China might become democratic over the years once it opens up to the rest of the world, its economy becomes liberalized, and gradually even democracy will follow. While democracy has not followed into China, on the contrary, China has become more and more authoritarian. It has become more dictatorial. It has become a closed society in terms of access to the democratic platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. While doing so, they have also become powerful militarily. They have become so powerful both economically and militarily that now they are in a position to challenge the United States. So, was Richard Nixon's decision a correct decision? Well, hindsight is always 2020. But at that point in time, 49 years ago, Nixon and Kissinger thought that if you don't bring in China on board the world community, then they will have multiple problems. One problem they were facing was with the belligerent the USSR, and the Vietnam War, as I mentioned, was not going the American way. So one limited objective they had that time was to ease pressure on those two fronts, and then of course access the huge Chinese market, because the Chinese population, as we know, is the largest in the world. It was then, it still is. So what happened? Nixon and Kissinger spent a whole week in China, opening up, meeting the supreme Chinese leader Mao Zedong, and of course Zhou Enlai, who was the premier. And it took 7 more years for the American and Chinese formal diplomatic relations to be established. If the US thought that it has done a great favor to China, China was deferential initially. You will recall the famous saying by Deng Xiaoping when he opened the Chinese economy in 1978 to say, bide your time, hide your strengths, and keep on building the capabilities. That famous 24 character saying that Deng Xiaoping said when he took over after Mao died in 1976, and of course Zhou Enlai preceded him. Zhou Enlai and Mao were old friends, and Mao of course was the supreme leader. He met Nixon only once during that trip. That trip of course has been documented in this very well crafted book called Nixon and Mao, The Week That Changed the World. It came out, it was published in 2008, and it's still relevant. Why Nixon and Kissinger decided to do what they did, and why China also accepted the proposal, and what happened thereafter. President Nixon won a landslide elections in 1973 following his visit in 1972, in fact, following his visit to China, and then went out of the office in disgrace because of the Watergate scandal. He kept on visiting China thereafter, and Kissinger, of course, is now a lifelong admirer and a friend of China. He has written books on China, he's visited China, he's 96, but he still believes that the American policy, the current American policy, especially initiated by President Donald Trump during his 5-year term, which ended in January 2021, was not conducive for world peace. In fact, if you go through this book, it's a fascinating account of that 1 week that the duo spent in China, trying to understand a society that was not very well known, that was not very accessible to the world, and of course the pretense that the Chinese put on, because they were not very well up either economically or culturally. So that's exactly what happened to them. This happened after 25 years of no communication. Subsequently, all American presidents have tried to follow a policy of engagement with China, thinking that it will, by embracing China, China would become more and more profitable, as I mentioned, and also democratic. That wish hasn't come true. China has become more belligerent, more aggressive, and more expansionist as countries around China's periphery in Southeast Asia, or as India now experiences. The standoff that India experienced for the last 10 months all along the LAC in Ladakh is a prime example of Chinese mindset. That now more and more, the Chinese leadership and especially President Xi Jinping thinks that the old saying that China is the center of the universe, it's the middle kingdom, and everybody else around it has to pay obeisance or pay tribute to the Chinese, is coming true. President Xi Jinping believes that he is destined to lead the world and become all-powerful leader in the world. Now, the Chinese and the American contest is not so much about a kinetic war like they fought in 1950, 1953, the Korean War, but it's about who owns technology, who dominates the technology in the world or the technological advances in the world. So Huawei being banned in US or Huawei being banned or being under scrutiny in China, in Canada, in India, in Europe is all part of that contest between a rising China and the world that does not want China to become all powerful. But this all began, as I said, 49 years ago with that trip. There's an Indian connection to that trip also, in a way. You will remember that there was a 1971 war that happened between India and Pakistan. That happened in December 1971. But Kissinger was already using Pakistan, and especially Pakistan's President Yahya Khan, to reach out to China. He in fact visited Pakistan first. From there he made a secret trip in 1971 to China to pave the way for this historic trip that I have mentioned about Richard Nixon's trip to China. This happened in 1971 when the tension between India and Pakistan over East Pakistan, and of course we will talk about that entire tension in 1971 where Pakistan did a crackdown in East Pakistan, Bangladesh was born in 1971, all that we'll talk in different episodes. But Kissinger was in the midst of this outreach to China, and therefore neither Nixon nor him, that is Kissinger, wanted this distraction in their effort to reach out to China, and therefore they wanted this war to be avoided, and they put pressure on India, tremendous pressure on India to try and avoid that war against Pakistan, because Pakistan was China's close ally and it was being used by the United States, who also had good relations with Pakistan, to build a bridge between the United States and China. But that was not to be. India, of course, launched the war on 3rd December 1971. Of course, that history is very well known. We will talk about it as we go along, because this is the 50th year of that war, the 1971 war, and there will be several episodes of Simply Nitin as we go along. But today I wanted to talk about that significant trip which changed world history in the 20th century. So if Americans dominated the 20th century, the Chinese are seeking to dominate the 21st century. But remember, the beginning of the rise of the Chinese can be traced back to that visit in 1972, or at least the opening up of the world to the Chinese, and the Chinese opening up to the world can be traced back to 1972. I thought, since this is the week it started 49 years ago, this is the time to speak about it. I'll have such interesting episodes going forward. Whenever these historic events come to mind, or if the dates coincide with the Simply Nitin episode, I will bring this to you. But until the next time, do keep watching and keep sending feedback, keep sending comments, subscribe to our YouTube channel, also follow us on various social media handles, and of course, as I keep saying, without your support, it's difficult to sustain our kind of journalism. So do support us financially wherever you can, whatever you can. Until the next time, it's goodbye.